Hi, I'm Brooke, and welcome back to the Science Spectrum's Female Scientist Fridays. The Science Spectrum has this really great exhibit on flight, but I wanted to add some of my own information to it. So today I will be talking about three of the greatest female aviators in history: Bessie Coleman, Amelia Earhart, and Jacqueline Cochran. While we often remember Amelia Earhart as the first great female aviator, that's not completely true. There was another woman working to pioneer the field of flight for both women and African Americans way before Amelia Earhart ever set foot in a plane. Bessie Coleman was born to a poor African American family in Texas and was the 10th of 13 children. She worked at a young age beside her mother and saved up to attend college, but later dropped out because of her lack of funds. In 1915, she moved to her brother's in Chicago, where she worked as a manicurist. She told her family that she wanted the chance to amount to something. When her brothers returned home from the First World War, they teased her because French women could fly airplanes and Bessie could not. This sparked something in her, and she was determined to be the first Black licensed pilot. She applied to multiple schools in the United States, but was rejected both because she was a woman and because she was an African American. Because of this, Bessie decided to attend flight school in France. She learned how to speak and write in French, and in 1921, she received her pilot's license. She became the first Black woman to ever receive a pilot's license. She returned to the United States and gave speeches about her flights and showed films of her flying. She refused to speak anywhere that was segregated and was praised by many for standing up for her beliefs. In 1922, she performed the very first public flight by an African American woman. Her dream was to own her own plane and open a flight school for African Americans in the United States. She continued to borrow planes and perform dangerous tricks like loop-the-loops and parachute jumping. Coleman was given the nicknames Queen Bess and Brave Bessie for her flying stunts. She toured the country giving flight lessons and encouraged women and African Americans to pursue flight as a career. She survived her first major plane crash in 1923 and was badly injured, but she did not let this stop her from flying. In 1925, she was able to buy her first plane, a Jenny JN4. Sadly, in April of 1926, after receiving her first plane, she and her mechanic took it out for a test flight that ended in the plane crashing. Both Bessie and her mechanic died in the crash. She was 34 years old. Her dream of starting her own flight school wasn't achieved in her lifetime, but she was honored after her death after the Bessie Coleman Aero Club was started in Los Angeles in 1929. Many African American pilots were influenced by the flight school and by Bessie's legacy. Bessie Coleman is remembered as a stellar performer and pilot who completed tricks for her audience. But our next pilot didn't perform tricks, rather she set records for female pilots. Amelia Earhart was born in 1897. She was described as a tomboy as a child and kept newspaper clippings of famous women in male-dominated fields. She saw her first plane at the age of 10 and was unimpressed. It wasn't until she attended a stunt flying exhibition a decade later that she became obsessed with flying. She received her first plane ride in 1920 and began flying lessons soon after. She purchased a second-hand plane nicknamed the Canary and set her first record by rising to the altitude of 14,000 feet in late 1922. She received her pilot's license in 1923, and she kept working odd jobs and kept flying as a hobby from 1923 to 1928. In April of 1928, she was asked to accompany a flight team across the Atlantic Ocean, and she received the title as the first woman to cross as a passenger. After that, she was determined to fly for her career. She competed in air derbies and continued to set records. In 1932, she became the first woman and second person to fly across the Atlantic Ocean alone. She received the Distinguished Flying Cross, and it was the first one ever given to a woman. She continued to set records, reaching new heights, literally, as she reached an altitude of 18,000 feet. She became the first person to fly solo across the Pacific Ocean when she flew from Honolulu, Hawaii to Oakland, California. She also was the first to fly solo from Mexico City to Newark, New Jersey. She was greeted with crowds and praised for her accomplishments everywhere she went. In 1937, she sought to be the first woman to fly around the world. She and her navigator, Fred Noonan, departed in Miami, Florida on June 1st and made it to Lae, New Guinea on June 29th. They had completed 22 of the 29,000 miles of this journey. After refueling in Leh, they left on July 2nd. They were supposed to land on Howland Island, which was a small island in the Pacific Ocean, but the trip from Leh to Howland was the most dangerous part of the trip. The U.S. Coast Guard had put a ship by the island to help Amelia Earhart navigate to the island because it was so small. The weather forecast had been wrong, and Amelia Earhart flew in cloudy weather. Earhart was commuting with a Coast Guard ship that had been stationed outside of Howland Island, but they lost her signal. She never landed on Howland Island, and after multiple search missions, she was declared dead in 1939. There is no record of what happened to Amelia Earhart, and hundreds of search missions have been conducted to this day. Amelia Earhart is mainly remembered for her mysterious disappearance, but she set records for women in aviation, and she was a pioneer advocate for women's rights during her lifetime. Our last female pilot today is Jacqueline Cochran. She is considered by many to be Amelia Earhart's rival, but she was able to accomplish so much as a pilot after Amelia Earhart pioneered the field. Jacqueline Cochran was born in 1906 in Florida as Bessie Lee Pittman. She was born to a poor family and did not like to speak about her childhood. She kept her husband's last name from her first marriage and began using Jacqueline or Jackie as her first name. She was a hairdresser in Florida before she moved to New York to work in the prestigious salons there. She happened to meet Floyd Odlum, a rich and successful businessman who suggested that she try her hand at flying. She began flight school in 1932 and received her pilot's license after only 3 weeks of lessons. She continued to fly and entered in racing. In 1935, she launched her own makeup brand named Jacqueline Cochran Cosmetics Wings of Beauty. She enjoyed not fitting into the mold of what most female pilots were at the time, tomboyish. She proved that women could both be feminine and fly planes. She continued to set records and would eventually become the first woman to win the Bendix, a flying competition that Amelia Earhart also competed in.
With all these achievements under her belt, Jackie still wasn't satisfied. When World War II started, she wanted to form a women's aviation unit to serve in the war effort. She flew bomber planes that had war materials on them in England and wanted to train other women to do so in the United States. So she started the WASP program, Women Air Force Service Pilots, who trained in Sweetwater, Texas. Jackie served as the director of the WASP program, and from 1942 to 1944, over 1,000 female pilots flew over 60 million miles carrying aircraft and personnel to aid in the war effort.
After the war, the WASP program ended, but Jackie still wanted to fly. In 1948, she joined the U.S. Air Force Reserves as a lieutenant colonel. She was the first female pilot in the United States Air Force. She continued to break records and fly for the rest of her life and encouraged other women to do so. In 1953, she became the first woman to fly faster than the speed of sound. She supported programs at NASA to help women qualify to be astronauts, and she also received the Distinguished Flying Cross 3 times for her skills in aviation. Jacqueline died a natural death in 1980, and while her achievements are often overshadowed due to Amelia Earhart's disappearance, she had some of the greatest flight records in her time. When she died, Jackie had more speed, altitude, and distance records than any other male or female pilot in aviation history. You can learn more about the science of flight and some of these amazing women at the Science Spectrum.